This is the Music History In-Depth podcast for February 19th through the 25th. On this week's show, we discuss a tragic fire that could have easily been avoided. A song about a yellow ribbon inspires a few movements, and we explain why the dates February 21st and the 22nd make Grammy voters cringe. This show goes more in depth about some of the events that we put on our daily podcast, the Music History Today podcast, which drops every single day, including weekends, wherever you get your podcast from. Now, on to this week's episode. Before I get into the crux of our first story, I'm going to talk about two things that may seem to have nothing to do with music, but unfortunately they do when it comes to this particular story. The first one is personal. These days I live in New York City, and when I go into a public space, I don't care where it is, restaurant, mall, club, whatever, I always check for an exit other than the front door. It's just something I've kind of trained myself to do ever since I started living in New York City, especially after 9/11, since I've been here since the mid-90s. When you live in New York or any other major city on this planet for that matter, you know that you can be the target for an attack by any given lone wolf or group at any given minute. So unfortunately, it's now just become a second nature to me. You may think that it's being a little overreactive or perhaps paranoid. However, fairly recent events like the guy driving his car into tourists on a bike path of all things, or a guy who came within a couple of minutes of blowing people up in Times Square, or recent subway attacks, or let's just say a shooting after a Super Bowl celebration, not in New York, kind of prove my paranoia, if you want to call it that, correct. Personally, I just think it's part of being careful. Not really paranoid, just a backup plan. The second thing concerns the group Van Halen and their use of riders in their contract. Back in the 1980s, the band took a lot of flack for having what the vast majority of people thought was just a crazy request in their backstage rider, otherwise known as a contract. The now famous rider, no brown M&Ms backstage in the candy bowls. The media made fun of it as just another diva move by another diva band. However, that line was actually the band's telltale sign to see if the promoters thoroughly read the contract. If the band saw brown M&Ms in any of the candy bowls backstage, then they knew that the promoters didn't actually read any part of the contract, and the band would need to go over every single line in the contract as to the specifications of everything, including what technical aspects were allowed and not allowed at that particular venue. So the next time you hear about some stupid line in a backstage rider, like say Mariah Carey needing to have her water chilled to a very specific temperature, don't automatically think that someone's just being a diva. Sometimes it's a test to make sure that the artist will be safe when they perform. Now, what does all of this have to do with music history or for this next event? Well, let's delve into that very depressing tale, and you'll see why I mentioned these things. The year 2003, the band, Great White. The band had finally made it big in 1989 with their fourth album, behind their top 5 smash hit single, Once Bitten, Twice Shy, a cover of Ian Hunter's 1975 song of the same name. Now, 14 years later, the remnants of the band's heyday, now called Jack Russell's Great White, with frontman Jack Russell, was on what I like to call the dinosaur rock tours, or retro rock, if you will, where you play small clubs and concert halls and play all of your old hits in order to keep the cash flow going to your pockets because you don't make money off of records anymore. On February 20th, 2003, the band was the headlining act at the Station Nightclub in West Warwick, Rhode Island. I actually had friends from Massachusetts who made the trip down there to Rhode Island to see this show. The club had an occupancy limit of 406, including the staff. The occupancy that night, 462. That was problem number one. Problem number two was no sprinklers in the club. The club building was originally a restaurant and didn't need sprinklers then. Once it became a club, it needed the sprinklers, but the local fire officials never noticed a change in the code in time to make the club put those sprinklers in. Not spending money led to problem number three, which was the insulation around the stage. The club used illegal, cheaper acoustic foam, which gives off a thick black smoke along with carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide when burned, instead of the legit non-flammable foam that they should have put in. Once you breathe in hydrogen cyanide, by the way, you get maybe 5 breaths before you black out and you die from smoke inhalation. This would be a really good time to get slightly political for a second, if you'll indulge me. And no, I'm not talking about woke culture or whatever everybody talks about these days. Now, we're going to get into regulations for just a hot second. The next time you get some businessman or politician complaining about regulations and that there are way too many of them and the businesses promise to be good if the behavior would just change and everything was gone and regulations disappeared, please remember this story, because as you'll see, regulations are there for a reason. Problem number 4, the rider in the contract. Not what was in it, but what wasn't in it. In the stage specifications, there was no mention of stage pyrotechnics, although the band later said that they had permission to use them, quote unquote. Because of this, Great White's tour manager, Daniel Bichil, put 3 fountain pyrotechnics on stage called gerbs. The gerbs shot continuous sparks in the air. There were 3 of them set up, 2 at a 45-degree angle and 1 in the middle, right at the foot of the drum kit. They shot 15 feet into the air for 15 seconds. The problem was that since they weren't part of the contract, they should never have been on stage or even allowed on stage, especially a stage that had a height of, you guessed it, less than 15 feet. Simple rule, kids. If there's no mention in the rider about using pyrotechnics or anything else that's considered extremely dangerous, just play it safe and don't use them. Don't try to get permission while you're there, because the person who you ask may not be the right person to ask. So, here's what happened. At 11:07 p.m., Great White took the stage and started going into their hit song, Desert Moon. About 10 seconds into the song, tour manager Daniel Bichil lit the gerbs. They shot sparks up into the air, catching the acoustic foam on fire. The fire spread within about 20 seconds. The band stopped playing. Lead singer Jack Russell watched the flames for a second, then said, "Oh, that's not good." Then he and the band rushed off the stage. They were filming the concert that night. You can watch it all unfold on YouTube. I will put the link to the actual video in the show notes, but be warned, you can actually hear people screaming for help in it, along with the very beginning of the front door pileup. The dude holding the video camera got out alive because he was smart enough to back away as the flames were beginning to kick before everybody else started to move. Still, it's extremely disturbing to watch. You've been warned. I'll put the link in the show notes. It's a good lesson if you can stomach it. No, they don't show dead bodies or anything. In any event, the club was equipped with 4 exits. And guess which one everybody went for? Yep, the front door. The front door was narrow, so people stampeded and trampled on top of other people trying to get out, but to no avail, as that thick, deadly smoke started filling up the room. Oh yeah, remember, no sprinkler system, so nothing was going to go and put out those flames. Many people died trying to get out the front door, which goes to my point about training yourself to look for another exit other than the front one. Witnesses said that some people actually tried going out another door, but a bouncer stopped them, of all people, saying that the exit was for the band only. Sad as that is. The entire club was fully engulfed in flames within 5 minutes. Of the 462 people in attendance, 100 of them lost their lives, with scores of others seriously injured. Among those killed were local radio station DJ Mike the Doctor Gonzalez, who was the MC for the night and was trying to save his equipment at the beginning of the fire and couldn't make it out in time. Remember, once that smoke got hit, you only get 5 breaths. That's it. Also killed was Great White's lead guitarist, Ty Longley, who witnesses said originally had gotten out alive with the rest of the band, but then went back into the building to try to save his guitar. Another slightly political aside, if you will. Don't ever be stupid and go try to save material items in any sort of emergency. Those can always be replaced. Your life, which is most important, cannot be. The fire became the 4th deadliest nightclub fire in American history. Immediately after the fire, blame started to be placed, of course, and it fell squarely on 3 people. Although, to be honest, the government really also should have been blamed for not dealing with those regulations in time. That's the local government, mind you. Tour manager Daniel Bichil was charged with 200 counts of manslaughter, for which he immediately pled guilty without even a trial. He received 15 years in prison, but only served 4 years, with 11 suspended. He's been out of jail since March 19, 2008. The club owners, Jeffrey and Michael Derderian, were charged the same as Bichil. They both pled no contest in order to avoid a trial. Michael Derderian received the same jail sentence as Bichil, but Jeffrey Derderian, for whatever reasons, received a 10-year suspended sentence, 3 years probation, and 500 hours of community service. That, by the way, really did not sit well with the families of the victims. Oh, my friends, by the way, they made it out alive. They went out one of the side exits. The sad thing is that this whole event could have been avoided and lives could have been spared if not for the decisions of the club owners, the tour manager, plus the local government's failure in not making sure that the club was up to code before it opened, because those sprinklers should have been put in back when it was a restaurant and before it became a nightclub. The station nightclub fire, or as some people call it, the Great White Fire, that killed 100 concert goers in West Warwick, Rhode Island on February 20th, 2003. Before we go any further, we'd like to tell you about our other podcast. The Music History Today podcast goes over the daily events in music history and drops daily, including weekends, on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. There's also the Music Halls of Fame podcast, which talks about a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, along with other Music Halls of Fame's museums and walks of fame. The Music Halls of Fame podcast drops every Thursday and can also be found on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to this podcast. The group Tony Orlando and Dawn were popular in the 1970s. The lead singer, Tony Orlando, whose real name, by the way, is Michael Anthony Orlando Casavides, was originally a singer in the 1960s group Wind. He was also a producer and executive at Columbia Records. He still wanted to perform, but due to contracts, couldn't perform under his own name with other record labels. There were a few songs that he really wanted to perform, so Tony devised a plan with Bell Records, who had also wanted him as a performer in their own right. Tony recorded a few songs, including this song about a guy who lives in an apartment complex on the floor above a woman who he really likes. In the song, which was written by L. Russell Brown and Erwin Levine, the guy asks the woman to knock 3 times on the ceiling if she loves him and twice on the pipes if the answer is no. You never actually find out if the woman likes him or not, but the song was kind of catchy. Tony recorded his part, and Bell Records overdubbed his voice with vocalists Tony Wine, Linda November, Jay Siegel, and Cynthia Weil. They released the song Knock 3 Times and other songs that Tony recorded under the name Dawn. Once the singles became popular, Tony ditched his exec gig and decided to go full steam into recording and touring. The group Dawn included his name in the group title, and he switched out the backup singer so that they could go on tour. The new group consisted of Tony, Thelma Hopkins, who became a sitcom actress back in the day, and Joyce Vincent Wilson. The group had a number of hits in the early 1970s and also had a very popular TV variety show called Tony, Orlando, and Dawn. Trust me, almost every big act back in the day had a TV variety show back in the 70s. That's how you got Donnie and Marie, Sonny and Cher, The Cher Show, The Carpenters, TV specials, etc., etc., etc. Tony, Orlando, and Dawn's biggest hit was probably the song Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree. It was written by Knock 3 Times songwriters Erwin Levine and L. Russell Brown and was produced by Hank Medress and Dave Appel. It was recorded in January of 1973 and was released as a single on February 19, 1973. On April 21, 1973, Tie a Yellow Ribbon hit number 1 on the Billboard Singles Chart, selling over 6.5 million physical copies worldwide. The song has made a couple of greatest songs of all time lists. The basis for the lyrics in the song is someone telling a loved one to tie a yellow ribbon round an old oak tree because he's been gone for 3 years. And if he gets home and he doesn't see the ribbon, then he will figure that the relationship is over, or as he says, get on the bus and blah, blah, blah. It's an old tradition that has gone on for centuries. Not the getting on the bus part, but tying a ribbon around a tree for somebody. To me, though, the lyrics are sort of average 70s dribble. Nothing all that spectacular, but to some people, it's actually made a couple of those greatest songs of all time lists. Probably not for the lyrics. In any event, I think that rather the song's popularity is probably due to how the song has been used throughout pop culture and world events, especially in times of distress. For instance, the first known time that it was used as a show of unity, the song that is, not the tying ribbons, was in the late 1970s. In 1979, followers of the exiled Muslim leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, forced the Shah of Iran, who was, by a lot of accounts, pretty brutal in his treatment of his own people, from power. The Shah fled to the United States, who had been backing his regime. On November 9th, 1979, students, no doubt with the Ayatollah's blessing, stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran, Iran, taking hostages. The students did it in part to demand for the Shah's return to face charges. For the record, the Shah never actually returned to Iran. He received cancer treatment in the United States and then received asylum in Egypt, where he passed away in 1980. The hostages were held in captivity for over a year. It was also a presidential election year. Then candidate Ronald Reagan used then President Jimmy Carter's perceived lack of resolve in getting the hostages released to his advantage, winning a landslide victory in November of 1980. During this time, Tony Orlando's songs started getting played again, and in memory of the hostages, people started putting yellow ribbons on their trees as a show of support for the hostages and to also show national unity. Strangely, in a twist of irony, one might say, what forced the hostages to be released wasn't really Ronald Reagan's tough talk at the time or Jimmy Carter's lack of negotiating skills. It was actually Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein. See, in late 1980, Hussein decided that now would be a really good time to go after Iran's rich oil fields. So, of course, he invaded the country. That was the start of the Iran-Iraq War. For the record, Hussein would try this invading ploy again in 1990 with the country of Kuwait, which led to the First Gulf War. Anyway, Iran decided that Iraq's invasion rightly took precedence over international pressure to release the hostages, so the Iranians cut a deal. The hostages were released on American Presidential Inauguration Day, January 20th, 1981, literally just after Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, allowing Reagan to make the announcement to the nation as president as opposed to Jimmy Carter. Reagan used it as a show of strength and his tough talk actually working, but in reality the timing was really just a big middle finger to Jimmy Carter by the Iranians. So there you go. The song and the yellow ribbon symbolism has been used more than a few times since then. It was used in the Philippines, for instance, in 1983 by the People Power Revolution when they tied yellow ribbons as a symbol while they were demanding the return of exiled opposition leader Benigno Aquino. Unfortunately for Aquino was assassinated literally the second he returned to the Philippines. As he descended the stairway of his plane, gunmen sent by his political rival, then Prime Minister Ferdinand Marcos, whose wife was the shoe-loving Imelda Marcos, opened fire on him. What followed next was the overthrow of the Marcos regime and the election of Aquino's widowed wife, Corazon Aquino, as the new prime minister. The song and ribbons were also used by protesters during the people's protests in Hong Kong in 2014. But this all started when Tony Orlando and Dawn's song Tie a Yellow Ribbon was released on February 19th, 1973. Our honorable mention this week is important because it brings it all back to the very beginning, for none of what we talk about on this podcast would be possible if not for this. In the mid-1870s, Thomas Edison was working on ideas for the telegraph and also the telephone, which was not invented by him, by the way. He was trying to get a telegraph transmission to repeat while also trying to do something similar with a telephone. He managed to come up with a revision which transferred vibrations onto a tin cylinder. Later on, Alexander Graham Bell, celebrated inventor of the telephone, changed the cylinders to wax, thereby making the invention even better. Many changes to the machine have been made over the next century or so, including flattening out the cylinder into a disc with grooves in it, otherwise known as an album or vinyl to all you hipsters out there. The United States Patent Office then gave Thomas Edison a patent for his invention that eventually was called a gramophone, but was originally called the phonograph. And they did that on February 19th, 1878. The kids, of course, now know it better these days as a record player. So there you go. Right within this time of year, give or take a week or two, the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences gives out its highest honors, called the Grammy Awards. I don't care how cynical you are as a musician or even as a music fan, you know that you would give anything to get your hands on one of these awards. It's one of the main stamps of approval. It's like the Oscars are for the actors, or the Emmys are for television actors, etc. Unfortunately, the Grammys are also nicknamed the Grannies, because it seems that most years the awards play it ultra safe and only give the main awards to acts who your grandmother would love. I even nicknamed them the VH1 Adult Contemporary Awards for giving the Album of the Year to acts like Norah Jones, Carlos Santana, John Baptiste, and Tony Bennett, while also recently giving Best Rap Album one year to Macklemore over Kendrick Lamar. I mean, really, people? Really? Dear Lord. In any event, there have always been problems with the awards, but if you know any Grammy voters, and I actually know a couple, and you mention the dates February 21st and February 22nd to them, they will probably start to cringe. I've watched it happen. It's hilarious. See, those dates highlight two blinding examples of how the Academy voters screwed up so badly that they're still trying to live it down to this very day. Let's start with February 22nd, 1989. That was the year that they started giving out the awards for Best Hard Rock / Metal Performance, Vocal or Instrumental. The nominees were AC/DC, okay, that's good. Iggy Pop, okay. Hard rock, yeah, I can dig it. Jane's Addiction, oh yeah, absolutely, great group. Metallica, oh, easily, overwhelming favorite, just give it to them right now. And Jethro Tull. Yeah, Jethro Tull, that hard-rocking, flute-playing band. Yeah, even Jethro Tull's lead singer Ian Anderson laughed about that one because even he didn't consider the band to be hard rock / heavy metal. At best, they were progressive rock. No matter, though, it was a lock that Metallica was going to take this award anyway. The group hadn't even hit its peak yet, and they were nominated for work for their album And Justice for All, which, by the way, was one of the greatest heavy metal albums of all time ever made. There was no way that they were going to lose this award. They even performed at the ceremony so that they could grab the award. It was kind of a big deal. It was televised. Unlike the first rap album award ever given out, which never was televised. Thanks, Academy. Morons. Back to the story. This particular award was Metallica's crowning achievement up to that point. Of course, they'd be much bigger and win more awards, but, you know. Remember when I said that they were nicknamed the Granny Awards? Here's a textbook example as to why. Because the audience gasped loudly when the award actually went not to Metallica or, hell, even Jane's Addiction or AC/DC or even Iggy Pop, but instead went to that hard-rocking, flute-playing band Jethro Tull. What an embarrassment. To add a little salt to the wound, by the way, Jethro Tull's record label took out an ad with a flute lying on top of iron bars. The ad's caption, "The flute is a heavy metal instrument." Ouch. That's ouch. Jethro Tull winning Best Heavy Metal Performance over very heavy favorite Metallica. Oh, dear Lord. On February 22nd, 1989. That one still makes me crack up. It's the funniest thing. Now then, on to another Grammy Award embarrassment. Literally one day over exactly 1 year later, on February 22nd, 1990 to be precise. Although this one was kind of the industry's doing and is, let's just call it the industry's dark secret. It was actually years in the making, in a very weird way. The Best New Artist Award used to be nicknamed the Kiss of Career Death Award because your career pretty much went down the tubes after winning it. For instance, in 1979, disco two-hit wonders A Taste of Honey beat out Elvis Costello and the Attractions, Toto and the Cars. In 1977, probably the most famous example of this, the Starland vocal band of the song Afternoon Delight fame beat out Boston and the funk band The Brothers Johnson, who had more than a few hits, both of those. In 2011, jazz artist Esperanza Spalding beat out Justin Bieber, Drake, Florence and the Machine, and Mumford & Sons. Yeah, that happened. Esperanza, though, is having a really good jazz career, so nothing but love there. Love her, absolutely love her. But still, Drake, Florence and the Machine, Mumford & Sons, Justin Bieber? Okay. February 21st, 1990's awards trouble actually started 6 months earlier. On July 21st, 1989, at a Club MTV show in Connecticut, a show I happened to be at. And by the way, if you're wondering how I happen to be or know a lot in this area, a lot of these things that happened in New England back when I was a record store manager and would get invited to all this stuff. That's how I knew people going to Great White in Rhode Island, which is in New England, and Connecticut, which is also in New England. In any event, at this Club MTV show, Milli Vanilli was singing the song Girl You Know It's True to a recording when the recording skipped really badly. They tried to cover it up by trying to sing to the skip, then panicked, and then they ran off the stage. The concert continued on as if nothing had happened. Now, if you watch the now famous VH1 behind-the-scenes TV show on them, you will hear people say that the audience didn't seem to really care. I assure you, though, people in the audience, myself included, noticed and cared that we just spent good money to watch people lip-syncing. Trust me, we cared. In any event, the rumors that Milli Vanilli weren't legit started going through the press. So imagine the surprise to those in the know when on February 22nd, 1990, Milli Vanilli won the Best New Artist Grammy. Among the other nominees that year, by the way, Nena Cherry, who had the big hit Buffalo Stance, folk rockers the Indigo Girls, who had a few hits, British neo-soul group Soul to Soul, who also had a few hits, and Mr. Funky Cole Medina himself, Mr. Tone Wildfang Loke. Okay, so none of those artists actually had much of a career past maybe a couple more years. Besides, the voters probably looked at mainly Milli Vanilli's album sales that year because that album, Girl You Know It's True, sold an awful lot of copies. It wasn't until mid-November of that year when Milli Vanilli's producer, Frank Farian, had to come clean and say that the group was a fraud. For the record, the actual people who sang all the songs on Milli Vanilli's albums were Charles Shaw, Brad Howell, John Davis, Jody Rocco, Linda Rocco, and Frank Farian himself. This, by the way, was not Frank Farian's first time doing this sort of thing. See, back in the mid-1970s, he sang under the name Boney M., then hired stage performers as the group Boney M in order to make concert and TV appearances, but really, it was his voice. Here's the thing, though. I've since kind of come around on this whole episode, especially as I've gotten older and especially after doing some research for these podcasts to help my memories of certain events. For instance, remember when I said that the event was the industry's doing and was actually the years in the making? Well, it kind of was. We'll leave AI out of it because I'm sure that's going to spark a huge controversy at the Grammys in the future at some point. Probably sooner rather than later. It is the industry's biggest open secret, though, that sometimes the people who you think are singing and playing instruments aren't the actual people themselves. Take, for example, the group The Monkees. Their first album actually had other musicians playing the instruments, not the four guys who were the Monkees themselves. Producer Phil Spector famously put another girl group's name on a record so it would sell more copies because the group who really sang the song wasn't famous enough at that time. This, by the way, was all in the 1960s. The issue continued even after this year's Academy Awards, this year being 1990. Because what happened in a first was that Milli Vanilli's award was taken away, and the award itself was vacated completely that year instead of giving it to whoever came in second that year. A couple of years later, singer Martha Wash wasn't credited as being the female voice behind Everybody Dance Now by C&C Music Factory and Strike It Up by Black Box after she was replaced in the music videos and on stage by singers who were thinner and looked like runway models. Sex sells, as always, I guess. Plus, this sort of behavior seemed to be a thing with European acts back in the day for whatever reason. I don't know why. I also think that Milli Vanilli's problem was that they started, let's just say, getting high on their own supply, and they started to get arrogant about their own success because they figured it was them. A couple of months after they won the award and months before they were officially found out, they gave an interview where one of them proclaimed themselves to be the new Elvis and said that they had more talent than Bob Dylan and Paul McCartney. That's really not going to win you a lot of sympathy votes when things go south, and boy, did they go south when it all came out. They got dumped on by both the press and other artists, famously including talk show host Arsenio Hall, who was kind of riding their case for a couple of years anyway. Their record label even offered a rebate on copies of their album if you still had the receipt saying that you bought a copy. I don't think many people actually had the receipt, so the record label was kind of okay on that one. I think that their crime, though, in a lot of industry people's eyes, to be honest about it, wasn't that they didn't sing on the album. It was that they crossed this imaginary line by blatantly flaunting it. Like, we know you're a fraud, but could you at least be quiet about it? After their careers imploded in spectacular fashion, Ron Pilatus, one of the guys in Milli Vanilli, turned to a life of drugs and crime before passing away from an accidental drug overdose on April 3rd, 1998. Fab, who was the other member of the group, at last check was still alive and was doing okay. Their producer, who started this whole mess, Frank Farian, continued working with groups like Eurodance groups La Bouche and Le Click. Frank recently passed away, very recently, on January 23rd, 2024. In any event, I don't think the Grammy people will look back on either February 21st or February 22nd with any type of fondness. Besides, pretty soon they're going to have to deal with all these AI fraudsters. That'll give them something to worry about. Milli Vanilli winning the Best New Artist Grammy on February 21st, 1990. And that is it for the Music History In-Depth podcast for February 19th through the 25th. Thanks for listening.